So do you ever struggle to finish Warhammer 40K games on time? Let's talk about a few tips, tricks and tactics for getting a game towards its bloodthirsty conclusion. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about speeding up Warhammer 40K gameplay, which definitely can be an issue for some, perhaps particularly if you're kind of new to the game. Warhammer 40k in general is quite a big game with a lot of rules, both in terms of the core gameplay, the mission and the army that you're playing, and even if you have a fairly reasonable grasp on them, there's lots of tricky decisions and interactions to be made, sometimes genuinely quite big choices that really could have a wrong or right answer and send the game down a completely different path. On top of all that, there's just a fair amount of basic actions to complete while you're resolving a game. Moving models can take some time, particularly if you've got a big horde-style army. Some factions do enjoy throwing really quite a lot of dice and rerolls around. And of course you want the game of 40k to be an enjoyable social occasion as well, and not just push the models around and do only the actions necessary to complete the game. In general, there's a fair bit going on, and between all that, it's perhaps not too surprising that some games can take really quite a long time. In a recent channel poll I did, it looks like the majority of people take around about 3 or 4 hours to play a 2,000 point game. Obviously things are going to go up or down a little bit depending on whether you're playing a bigger or smaller points value than that. I'd hope that most 1,000 point games might be a bit more in the sort of 2 to 3 hour sort of mark, potentially a bit less than that if you're very experienced and know your army well. Probably the biggest bit of context that I got from the comments on that poll was that context is really important. It kind of stands to reason that tournament games where 2 players know their rules really quite well, in general that does tend to get resolved under the 3-hour time limit that you usually need to complete your games by. Whereas say a more relaxed casual game in your own home with mates and getting distracted and chatting about other things as well, it is likely to go on a bit more, and kind of understandably so. There always does come a time when you have to put your dice down though, either round timings in tournaments, or having to pack up because the hobby store's closing, or just that you need to get to bed at a reasonable time for work tomorrow. I do think it's always a little bit sad when you've had quite an interesting game, but you basically have to pack up and go home essentially midway through. Sometimes you might have reached a point where there was an obvious victor, or the main interesting bit of the battle has been done, but it's a bit disappointing if it was all shaping up for really quite a dramatic final fight, but you just don't have time for it. I think it's also important to finish games from a sort of fairness point of view as well. Some armies just naturally tend to do better later in the game, maybe armies that have needed to back off and then come back swinging once they've destroyed the enemy's threats that are pushing into their side of the board, or certain factions that have a bunch of late gameplay shenanigans going on. For that reason in this video I thought it could be good to talk through a whole bunch of potential time saving tips, some things that might be more or less applicable to some people's armies or experiences, but just a whole load of ideas, at least some of which will probably be useful to most of you. First up, perhaps the very most simple and most obvious one is to be able to know your rules well. I think in most people's experience, the real thing that is really going to slow down a game is if one or both of the players just have no idea what their units do in game each time they have to do anything with a squad, whether it's move it, shoot it, or take damage with it. They have to go flicking through the codex, looking up certain stats and things, and maybe reminding themselves of core rules of the game. That is one of the reasons why you can always expect games with newer players to generally take a fair bit longer than you would with experienced players. But more so if you're a newer player and you haven't had a bit of a sit down to have a read over your rules and try and get at least a little bit memorised. I think it's kind of unrealistic to expect that everyone will grasp their entire army all the way in one go, particularly when you might be adding in new units to your force or experimenting with different detachments or something. A lot of it will just come with time and experience, and in general people who have been playing 40k for many years will be able to play a fair bit faster if they want to or need to. Though if you're picking up an army that maybe you haven't played in a while, or you're using your current army in a very different way, there's definitely a fair bit of prep that you can do beforehand. Just literally having a read over each of your unit's profiles as a bit of a refresher sometime, something that only needs to take 5 or 10 minutes really. That'll just bring things to the front of your mind as to what their stats are and how good their weapons are, and maybe just give you a few more insights as to what they can and can't do, perhaps reminding you of a niche ability that you often forget. It's just usually going to be helpful if you're not super familiar with the army. Perhaps to a similar sort of level, if you're going to a tournament or an event, it's worth having at least a practice game or two with your army, often several if you really want to try and master it and do well. Even just playing a couple of games though is going to iron out a whole bunch of rules questions and issues. You'll be forced to look up profiles and develop a bit more of a general plan of what you normally do with your army, so you don't have quite as much indecision when you're playing games. Kind of hand in hand with that, it does make sense that occasionally you still are going to need to look up rules, so having them easy to access and knowing your way around them is generally a good idea. 40k does have plenty of rules, though I'd argue in 10th edition, faction rules and things have got far better than in 9th, at least from an ease of access point of view. Stratagems and detachment rules can be all on one page, so it's only really that and codex datasheets for the most part, besides any mission and core rules that you're playing with. And there are plenty of ways that you can have those really easy to hand, maybe having datasheet cards from Games Workshop if you fancy. I've seen various people print out indexes and things as well. In general, the Warhammer app's quite easy to search with if you do need to reference things quickly, or things like Warpedia can be easy enough to bring up and navigate mid-game if you just have one or two questions perhaps. One thing I quite like to do is, if I'm experimenting with an army that I've not played much before, is to write out a basic paper cheat sheet. Just have a look through the rules, either online or in my codex, and literally just copy down a few of the stat lines and profiles and special rule subtleties that I'm pretty sure I'll forget when it comes to the game. Usually alongside the stratagems that I think I'll use, and maybe a few reminders for, say, in the command phase you need to think about using this stratagem, make sure you've declared this character's ability and gain your command point and things, which again can certainly speed some things up if you just have to go through a quick checklist and not be trying to remember if you've forgotten anything. In any case, lots of ways of making rules easy and handy to access. Different people have different styles. Sticking with planning things a bit, if you've got opportunity to, then you can do a fair bit of organisation, busy work before the game. Maybe when you're packing your army, make sure that you've packed them with the squads next to each other, just so it's super easy to get them out of the case and go, as opposed to just having everything jumbled in together and having to spend a good 5 or 10 minutes picking out each squad from each other, trying to find exactly which special weapons go with what and everything. Alternatively, you could just get there a little bit earlier, do a bit of setup and have your squads laid out, and maybe use the opportunity to help set up the terrain and things, maybe deploy it if you already know what mission you're going to be playing. And again, that can just be one less job that you have to do when you actually get to playing. If you've got a huge ton of models to move around, say playing something like Horde, Tyrannid, Guard or Orcs maybe, you could maybe think about using some movement trays. As I've played a fair bit with a Horde Guard army, I can attest that it does help with big Horde armies at least a fair bit. It does take a little bit more time setting up, but in general I do feel like it does save at least a little bit of time moving just one base rather than having to literally pick up and move every single model individually. Obviously measuring carefully to make sure that you're not gaining any advantage with the edges of the models, and usually just translating the base from A to B. Often though, with big ranked up infantry units, you will have good reasons that you might need to abandon movement trays mid-game, maybe trying to stretch out to an objective, get some units in cover or line of sight, or if the squad gets into combat and needs to be a bit more free-form at piling into melee. Sometimes they might not work super well with a unit moving across terrain as well. I think for me I'd have to be playing with really quite a lot of models before I cracked out movement trays really. I usually tend to use mine if I'm playing something like 100 to 250 models on the table as opposed to less. I feel like they actually don't save a load of time if you've not got absolutely tons of infantry on the board. You can get really quite a long way just by moving the models at the extremities of the unit, so say the first model there, the ones at the side and the one at the back, and then translate the middle of the unit so it looked like what it was before. You might lose a tiny bit of precision, but provided you're not trying to do it to gain an advantage or anything like that, it's hardly likely to be causing any problems, and most people are pretty happy with it as part of the whole playing by intent thing. For actual in-game interactions, if you think that time is going to be tight, or you just want to keep the game moving at a slightly faster pace, it might be worth just thinking about whether or not certain actions or rules disputes are actually really worth contesting all that much. I feel like perhaps this does require a little bit of good understanding of the probability of things happening, but a lot of the time it just might not be really worth your time to roll kind of pointless dice in game, even if in theory literally every chance of doing something successful could give you an advantage. There's just a good chance that, say 99% of the time, a certain dice roll or trying to make a whole bunch of saves might just not really be worth the point in doing it if there's clearly overwhelming odds. Say maybe a good example is if a single lone guardsman gets charged by 10 Khorne berserkers who are going to be throwing something like 50 odd attacks at them. It might just make sense to just offer to pull that guardsman model as opposed to make the opponent literally roll out all the dice. It just feels like it's going to be a lot of rolling for almost zero chance of anything happening. I know there's plenty of people out there who like to say there is always a chance, which is technically true, but at the same time, if the chance is something like 1 in a million, I'm happy to forego that and just save the rolling for something that actually does have a tiny chance of doing something. Maybe if the chance is more like 1 in 100 or something. Perhaps that could be rolling out if it was something that was actually genuinely going to be very important to the game and it wouldn't take too long. Maybe another similar one for avoiding pointless dice rolling would be multiple weapon profiles attacking a unit. Say if you've got a Lehman Russ Vanquisher tank or similar with a great big cannon that could one-shot an enemy vehicle, probably makes sense to fire the big cannon first as opposed to all the small arms. A bunch of heavy bolters and stoppers and things might just do some kind of pointless damage to it, and then the big cannon either kills it or doesn't. Might make sense just to check whether or not the big cannon is just going to blow up the enemy vehicle before you waste all the time rolling out the other dice that might have turned out to be completely pointless if the enemy vehicle was dead anyway. Occasionally rolling out all of your own attacks just might not be worth bothering with either. If you literally need to be rolling a stupid amount of dice to even take off one wound against an enemy unit, say maybe Imperial Guard lasguns firing at a Land Raider. If you're hitting on a 4, wounding on a 6, and then they're saving on a 2+, bear in mind you're going to need to throw 72 attacks to have an average chance of chipping off a wound. It's definitely not nothing, but the amount of work that you're putting in to do a tiny bit of damage that might not matter is quite a lot. Sometimes it might genuinely be worth it, particularly if they do have a chance to actually finish off the thing. It's kind of a call that you'd have to make between spending a good bit of time rolling a bunch more dice and eking out every single advantage, or just moving on to the things that are actually likely to kill the thing. In general, I'd say it's all just a bit of weighing up between how much any individual dice roll really matters, if it's very likely to not go your way, and maybe just skip out on a few of the things that really are kind of pointless, but at the same not missing too many chances where genuinely if you roll kind of well it might do something that's pretty important to the game. Perhaps in a similar sort of vein, maybe things like meaningless rules disputes could just be something to go a little bit lighter on. Again, maybe just a bit of judging as to whether or not it actually matters to any great extent for the game, perhaps particularly if it's in the closing stages and it's not going to influence victory points. If the answer isn't particularly obvious in the rulebook or any other sources that you have to hand, you could just offer to roll off for the rule if you both think it's something different, or just concede to the opponent's point of view if it's really not going to matter too much. Again, with the dice rolls, if you do genuinely think that a rule's being played wrong, it might just be worth thinking about whether or not it's worth taking the time to properly contest that and properly find out, rather than just moving on with the game. Another source of taking a bit more time in 40k games is just a bit of decision paralysis, maybe not knowing exactly what choice you're going to go for. And perhaps one of the best options for reducing that is to just try and have a good think as to what your unit's going to do in your turn while it's still your opponent's turn, and then resolving other actions like rolling dice for shooting and things like that. Ideally, when it gets around to your turn, you probably shouldn't be approaching the game with absolutely no idea as to what any of your units are going to do. Hopefully have a rough plan for at least a few things that seem kind of certain, and then maybe you can vary the rest a little bit depending on what secondary cards you draw, or maybe how the last few combats go in the enemy's turn. Ideally, maybe you don't want to be wasting a massive amount of time between a close decision where you could do one thing or another. Sometimes you might be left with really quite direct decisions with what units do, maybe do things like either holding an objective or trying to make a risky charge on an enemy unit that could be absolutely game winning. I feel like sometimes you can think it through a little bit and try and work out the risk and reward. Sometimes the odds just might be genuinely kind of finely balanced. And just to speed things up a bit, you could just literally roll a d6. On a 4+, you'll do the one action. On a 1 or 3, you do the other. And then just commit to that if they both seem like kind of equally good options in the moment. Another bit of prep work that can keep 40k games flowing smoothly is to have some sort of scoring system in place. Lots of people use the Tabletop Battles app, which Goonhammer developed. It's just really quite nice and intuitive to use score tracker that you can literally enter in objectives to, and can also speed up things like adding up scores or drawing cards, and it's fairly easy to reference what's been scored on what rounds. I certainly recommend giving that a try if you haven't already. Otherwise though, things like a pretty clear printed score sheet is something that some people like to use. Might take a little bit of time to print them out sometime, or have a stash of them in your bag, but I feel like that's another quite nice solution for keeping scoring going smoothly, a bit more tactile, and both players can very easily see what's being scored on what round at all times if they want to, though it does require a bit more adding up at the end of the game and stuff. Perhaps other than not knowing rules so well, realistically I think the thing that tends to slow down 40k games the most is just not really being all that focused on the game. Obviously you want to make it a social occasion, have a chat with your opponent, catch up with their news, talk about their hobbying and everything like that. Though it is just worth bearing in mind that if you also want a game to be finished, you do need to balance that out a little bit with keeping the pace of play moving, particularly if you've got a time limit that one of you needs to get back for. I guess occasionally that might be catching yourself from time to time, and maybe trying not to go completely off on a completely different conversation topic, and perhaps trying to save that till after the game, though occasionally you might need to politely prompt your opponent if they are just taking a really excessive time with taking their turn, Obviously balancing with having a good game and a chat, of course. Not literally every 40k game in the world needs to get finished, particularly if you're having a good time anyway. Maybe in tournaments there might just every so often be some occasional deliberate slow play going on. The usual thing from 40k's past being to try and get ahead in points early in the game and then just play extra slowly. So the game finishes around about turn 3 or something when the one player's in control of all the objectives. I feel like that tended to be a bit more of a thing if you went back 10 years or so with 40k, though the game has progressed a fair bit since then. I think people tend to be kind of wise to that, and it's certainly not tolerated well at tournaments at all. Though if it's obvious that your opponent is just going incredibly slowly early in the game, the general advice is that you probably need to raise that with a tournament organiser a bit sooner rather than later. And if there have been cases where you've been burnt at that with tournaments, it could be worth using a chess clock, even if I feel like you're probably using it quite a lot of times for people who wouldn't really have much issues and might just be for a little bit of insurance for that one difficult game. To try and keep the pace of the game moving, when you do need to take breaks to grab a drink or use the bathroom or something, it could be worth trying to hang on until the opponent's movement phase to do so perhaps. That generally tends to be the area of the game where the least stuff is happening for one player, and you're literally just sitting watching your opponent move their models around, excepting perhaps if you've got some sort of tricky stratagem or a big scary unit that needs to fire Overwatch. If that's not the case though, you could just literally say that you're happy for your opponent to move their models, roll their advanced rolls and everything else while you're gone. And then when you're back, hopefully you can just move straight into the shooting phase and the serious business of getting your units blown to bits. I guess that does mean trusting your opponents to play fair and everything. I feel like it is kind of rare that people actually choose to cheat in a game of model soldiers, even in tournaments and things, provided your opponent's a reasonable person. Another thing that gets brought up a fair bit in current 40k is playing by intent. Generally the idea is that you clearly state what your intent with each move is to your opponent, and if they think that you aren't able to do that sort of thing, or if they ask you if you've got any sort of reactive abilities that could get triggered by it, then you play very openly and honestly, so you're not, say, left in the situation where someone thought their squad was entirely hidden, but it turns out that the other player doesn't think that they are. That sort of thing could easily be checked by saying things ahead of time. Just in general, I feel like if both players are playing just a little bit more relaxed with that, communicating clearly with their opponent as they go on through the game, it's just going to make things a bit faster at the same time. Perhaps particularly with things like super fine positioning of units, provided you're not trying to do any weird model shenanigans. You could say be fairly happy that the one person would have been able to get all their models into combat, for example, by moving them in a certain way, even if you're maybe not ridiculously precise about moving every single model and just move things kind of roughly. Maybe the same could be true for things like gotchas. If you communicate them clearly, then you won't have both players just massively stressing about any single movement triggering an opponent's trap card. Again, I maybe feel like that's one factor in people playing with a bit more confidence. If you're turning up to a game when you know that time might be limited, then perhaps the exact choice of army that you go for might be something that you could factor in. Maybe if you know that you're playing after work against someone at the local club and that they have to have everyone out and closed by 10 PM, you might need to play fairly promptly if you're going to be able to get the entire game done. And certain armies are just maybe a bit more conducive to that than others. Typically the armies that play faster tend to be just taking a few bigger threat models to move around the board, as opposed to really big hordes with lots of small guns and loads of dice to roll. For an equally fast playing player, I'd say an army of Imperial Knights is going to play a lot faster than a 200 model horde of Orc Boys. Those are obviously kind of extreme examples, but I feel like the majority of armies could at least skew to one way or the other a little bit there. Perhaps just taking an extra few tanks or monsters compared with what you would have done. Perhaps some slightly faster and more directly destructive stuff as opposed to slow grindy units or things trying to jump around and do shenanigans. If you're getting towards the end of a game and time is getting tight, then depending on exactly what's happening on the board, there might be a lot of scope for just trying to talk out the last turn or so. Perhaps particularly easier to do if one player's kind of won the damage game at that point, and the last few actions are just going to be players scrabbling around for as many victory points as possible, as opposed to having really big pivotal conflicts where, say, a big melee might win or lose the game. Some people like this a bit more than others, though in general I feel like it is really quite easy to wrap up a game of 40k quite quickly, provided you have done the main fighting game and there's just not a ton of time or turns left for doing clever things to outwit your opponent and just focusing on drawing secondary cards, scoring primaries, and only doing the interactions or pivotal damage combats that will actually lead to scoring and achieving points. It might help a bit if both players are perhaps just a little bit generous to the opponent with obvious kills, such as say your jump unit would have moved there and destroyed my unit of objective holders with average rolling, and then after that my tank would have been able to gun down those, for example. Sometimes it might be a bit rough and ready, and in reality there might have been chances that things could have gone differently, but I still feel it's probably better to do something like this as opposed to just leave the game completely unfinished if that's the choice. It's definitely more doable in some circumstances than others, but particularly for turn 5 you should be able to get that done really quite quickly in the vast majority of circumstances, and just focus on literally the things that can score you victory points or deny your opponent from getting them. Finally, if you really want to play 40k on a bit of a time trial, you could do a bit of practice with chess clocks, maybe a little bit try hard for a lot of players out there perhaps, but pretty commonly used in at least some of the more serious grand tournaments out there where games must be completed in 3 hours, and if your opponent's playing it impolitely and very slowly and they're not giving you the time to do so, there needs to be a system for highlighting that. The idea is that you both have an amount of time on the clock, and when you switch to the other player doing actions and making decisions, you flip the time over to them, and then when they choose to go back to you, they flip it back to you. Even if the game is a little bit more casual and you're not playing super strict, it can still be potentially interesting to have, say, an app on your phone to do that. It can just be a good way to highlight whether you're playing quite slowly and what you're sinking the most time into. Maybe a little bit of comparison as to how fast you're going compared with your opponent doesn't hurt as well, even if it's just all in the process of learning and speeding up play a bit. It does have the downside of being just one other thing to think about, pack and manage and everything, but I feel like if you play a few games with a chess clock, it will focus your mind on speed a little bit if that really is a problem for you. And of course it's pretty standard accepted practice in big tournaments and things. In any case, a bit of a ramble there through a whole bunch of different time-saving things. There really are quite a lot of ways that you can think about a Warhammer game, and different ways that you can approach saving a bit of time on different things. In general, it broadly comes down to just being prepared, knowing rules, having any things that'll save you time on hand, and having a well-organised army that you can deploy fairly quickly. And then in-game, just keeping up the pace of play, maybe not worrying too much about things that are likely a bit on the trivial side, or would involve rolling a massive amount of dice for literally no gain. A bit of friendly playing with intent with the opponent, perhaps not stressing crazy amounts about tiny picky details, if it's clear that the opponent truly can achieve the actions they want to with their miniatures if they measured everything super precisely. In any case, hopefully that's a little bit of inspiration for a few of you out there. Let me know your thoughts on speed of play in Warhammer 40k. Is it something that's a negative effect on your games in any way? And which are the areas that you think you might need to improve on out of these, if any of them? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you'd like to help support the channel and keep these videos coming, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description down below. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, including this one going out, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.